Soon finalizing the Data Storytellers Board of Advisors panorama, where we have guests on who we had fantastic time with last year, and one of them is Ylan Kazi, and Ylan is a great friend of the show, member of our community, Board of Advisor member who contributed a lot to the Data Storytellers story in the past 10 years. And Ylan, sir, welcome back on the show. It's a pleasure to have you back.
Yeah, great to be back. Thanks for having me again.
Fantastic. And look, a lot of the listeners already know you, but if you don't mind just giving a short introduction for those who don't know you yet, and maybe just the short summary of our collaboration that we've done, of course, I will kind of chip in to paint a clear picture.
Sure. Yeah. So we had connected, I think, almost 2 years ago now at this point. And really kind of that shared interest in, I think, overall data leadership, what it means to be a chief data officer, and just the many types of challenges that occur, and really talking about how there can be a playbook for it and just different approaches to finding solutions to it. So that was, I would say, kind of the start of that. And then I think as we've gone forward, really being more involved within the overall data leader community and connecting with other great data leaders as a part of that community.
Mm-hmm. And you've been a part of this evolution where now we have the opportunity to take a closer look at your career playbooks, and really the best and the brightest that we've had the pleasure to work with over the past 2 years. And we're kind of proud of creating that platform where we can showcase real achievement. Right. So where these titles and nominations are not really given out as kind of like a token, but treating it with the necessary and serious attention that we think it deserves. And your example is like perfect in this, because you were someone who I really enjoyed working with last year. And we did take a look at your playbook for prioritization, which is a huge topic in the community, the whole idea of prioritization and the power of prioritization and your methodical approach. Those who missed it, you can definitely check it out. It's one of our most popular episodes. And today we're going to dive deeper into some of the career aspects and how to position data analytics in the organization. But before we dive into that, would you mind just giving a quick introduction into what your role is over at Blue Cross Blue Shield, North Dakota? What is your mandate, and just a few words about your role?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm the Chief Data and AI Officer here at Blue Cross Blue Shield of North Dakota. So I lead a strong centralized data team. So everything from data engineering, architecture, data governance, all the way through analytics and now data science and AI. So really kind of that end-to-end responsibility. And I really see it as my role to help the organization find value in our data, and at the end of the day, help enable our business stakeholders and the members that we serve within the community.
So even the title Chief Data and AI Officer, what was the evolution of that title? When you came to the organization, did this role exist, or was that created? Maybe just a little bit of background on that would be useful.
Sure. So I started at the organization almost 2 years ago. And when I joined the organization, the Chief Data Officer role was newly created. So I joined as a Chief Data Officer. I inherited a pretty large team. And there was a huge evolution in our team structure, the strategy, how we obtain value from the data in the organization. I would say very recently, my role has expanded to formally include the AI components. And a big part of that was just my prior background at larger healthcare payer organizations, leading data science teams, and also ensuring that there was that link with our overall data strategy and now our overall AI strategy. And I think what a lot of organizations are probably finding, not just ours, you can't really have an AI strategy without a data strategy. Eventually, you're going to have to go back and really look at your data foundations. You're going to have to ensure higher quality data assets, and data itself will usually be the biggest limiting factor to any type of AI solution. So I think we've taken a good approach of, first starting with the foundations and then really working in parallel as we continue to mature as an organization.
So the data strategy piece too, it's huge this year. So even in our upcoming Nashville masterclass, by the time probably people listen to this conversation, we already had Nashville, our annual member event, and data strategy is a huge topic there. It's kind of like a mystical. There's a shroud of mystique around that topic of data strategy, but we're going to dissect it and understand it through the lens of different organizations. We have Dejan Mitkovsky from FanDuel coming, for example. We'll talk about his approach to that, but we'll have this topic showcased from multiple perspectives, right? So maybe you would be really well positioned to talk about this because I follow you on LinkedIn as well, and you have like really takes that I find fascinating on this whole subject of data strategy and AI in large organizations. So without talking about anything specific, of course, of what you guys do, because definitely every organization now have their own projects in data aspects. So without going into details on that one, just your view, like how would you, even a business leader who listens to this conversation and they've been hearing these words thrown around, how would you approach telling them what the difference is between a data and an AI strategy? This is a data strategy, this is an AI strategy, and this is why it's important to you. Like, there's no big business leader who has not given this any thought yet, but maybe your approach as a seasoned professional in the data space would be useful, because I know that we have a lot of listeners also who are business leaders who just are interested in becoming more involved in true data-driven change.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and just the whole data strategy topic is very multifaceted. Now, with that being said, I would really distill it down quite simply into basically thinking about a data strategy. It's essentially a plan, and it shows an organization how they're going to collect, store the data, manage it, and utilize it to achieve their business goals. So a very solid, strong data strategy is one that helps to enable better business outcomes. And I think that can help really kind of frame up where somebody who is a data leader or chief data officer can focus their time and efforts on, because no two data sets are created equal. There are always going to be, I'll just say the top 10 data assets that drive most of the value within an organization. I think the other piece about it being connected back to the business is you never want to focus on data for data's sake. There should always be an end business goal or business objective that it's aligned to. Otherwise, quite frankly, you're probably wasting your time. And I think your business stakeholders are not going to get the types of outcomes that they need to get from the underlying data.
Mm-hmm. And what would you say, because I know that also for someone who's not in the space and is not familiar, it can be a reason for for a hang up or distraction that, hey, like, why is it that in some organizations have chief data officers and some chief analytics officers and some chief data and analytics officers, right? So, for example, maybe even an example in your case, like you guys also deal with analytics in the organization. What would you say to bring clarity to that question, and so we move on to the more exciting parts of the conversation?
Sure, that's a great question. The challenge with the chief data officer role is that there isn't one standardized definition to it. And so both of the chief data officer roles that I've had end-to-end responsibility for data analytics and data governance. That isn't necessarily the norm. There are some roles that are very more data management focused, so more on the engineering, the architecture. And then you have roles that are, chief data analytics officer, which they'll have both of them, or they may just have the analytics piece. And so I think that automatically makes it more challenging to even do that comparison or define it. But I think once you have defined the role or defined the mandate, then it becomes easier for business leaders to understand what does that person focus on and how can they help once again enable those business outcomes. And I will say that in an ideal organization, you actually wouldn't need this type of role. in an ideal organization, business strategy and data strategy are perfectly interlinked. But I don't think you see that very often, even in the technology industry. Like, I know that Amazon doesn't really have a chief data officer. They don't need one. They've really made an effort to be more of that data first organization, and that's really built into their DNA. But most companies, especially ones that have been around for decades or even centuries, they started off very differently. And so in many cases, they're undergoing a type of data evolution, and it's not necessarily core to their business.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And here's a question that I just thought of as you mentioned, like how some organizations just have it in their DNA. They don't need a chief data officer, but the organizations that have been around for 50, 100, 150, 200 years. I mean, our blue chip clients, most of them are like insanely old. These companies have been around for a long, long time, and they have a certain organizational culture. And there, someone needs to lead the charge to actually make data real in a business and an integral part of it. So I know for a fact that a lot of our members who are effective chief data officers in their organizations, but they don't necessarily have that official C-level role. And it's now becoming ubiquitous that you do have the CDO. I've been in this specific field, in this specific place of these roles developing and emerging in large organizations. So I know that a lot of, like, for a long time, when we talked about CDOs, we talked about anyone who's leading data in a business, whoever the head of data is. But now CDO is a specific thing. It's an actual title. It's in the C-suite. It is a seat at the table. When it's a big question, I acknowledge, so feel free to give it a swing from any angle you'd like. But for those members that we have where there is no chief data officer role yet, but it's kind of in the air. Everyone, maybe people have not articulated it or put their finger on it. Maybe it's something that's being talked about, but it's not real yet. What would you recommend those companies, maybe someone who's listening who could be well positioned to become that, right? What would you recommend to create that opportunity and drive it to an actual C-level role being created?
There's the element of having this role start off informally. So let's say if you have a more senior level data leader within an organization, they can actually be doing some of this work without having that formal title. And I would argue that's not necessarily a bad thing. I do think that there are still many organizations today that aren't yet ready for this type of role. So even if they were to create it and have somebody or hire somebody in that role, that individual may not be set up for success. And that's always a risk with a new role like this. Is there can be a lot of excitement around it. A new person comes in, but then 18 to 24 months from their start date, the business isn't getting the results that they wanted to see. And so they think about, well, maybe we brought in the wrong person, or they're just not able to execute fast enough. The reality, though, and just in talking with many of my peers in the industry, is that many times they'll go into a position and not have the right mandate for what they can focus on. They also may not get the type of resourcing that's actually needed to effectuate that change. And then they're also having to many times go against a very ingrained culture that could be averse to change, because in any type of data transformation, it's essentially, it takes a lot of change management within it. And you're also in many cases either asking people to do things differently or think differently. And if you don't have that right support, especially that senior level leader support, it can be very challenging. And so I think it's helpful going in with both eyes open. I think it's also helpful if you're already a part of the organization, you can transition that role into a more formal title, but do it in a way that helps to kind of de-risk that path going forward.
Mm-hmm. And this question of culture, right? So the whole idea that data literacy is a culture question in the company. So we hear this being talked about a lot, and there is almost like a discipline being established right now on data literacy, creating a data literate workforce. Now, there's always a conversation on, should we even talk about this with the language of data literacy, right? Or should we switch to data fluency? But if you're in that space, you know what we mean by data literacy. It's another question that when you're actually driving that change in the business, is this how you should position it? So I've seen that the whole topic, even the phrase data literacy, probably emerged around, I guess, 2018. It's like a very new thing, where it's a term that's being talked about, that's being built on, that's that there's interest in it, and now there are organizations who also work specifically to create data literate organizations, right? So would you mind talking about data literacy from your perspective? Like, how did that conversation emerge and evolve in your business? And then how did data literacy, what kind of role did that play in the culture that you've created so far over at Blue Cross Blue Shield North Dakota?
Sure. Yeah. So the data literacy, I consider it one broader component of an organization's data culture. There are many other components that kind of encompass an entire data culture, but data literacy is very important for a few different reasons. I think there's kind of the base level data literacy. So it's essentially what is the expectation, or what is the level of data literacy that an organization needs for their individual employees. And so everything as simple as, can an individual interpret a basic chart or graph? Do they know how to ask the right questions to get what they want in terms of a specific data or analytic solution? And then I would take that as more of that base level. I think from there, then you get to more of the higher order ones, where what do individuals do in situations where they may have to make decisions off of imperfect data? And that's an area where I think many data culture, data literacy efforts get hung up, because a business stakeholder may say, well, the data is not 100% quality, or it's not, I don't have everything I need. So, let's go back to the data team, let's have them fix it. And in many cases, that can almost be an excuse to not make a decision to move forward. I think too that with the right amount of data literacy, individuals realize that data is not just on the data team to essentially own it. And I think that's an important concept, because data isn't really owned by a chief data officer or a data team. It's really technically owned by the organization. It is a business asset. I think you may have subject matter experts that have, more expertise around it, or that may work with it more, but they're really more, they're taking on more of like a stewardship and accountability function. They don't necessarily own it. And I think as you think about it in that way, that helps to get rid of many of these data silos, or even these territories that are formed. Because if you're told you're a data owner, you kind of want to keep that to you or to your team. When you're a data steward, though, it's really about enabling and being able to share that with others in the organization. And by doing that, you can create a lot more value when it's not siloed. So I see it as this multi-step approach. And I think even in our organization, we're definitely, I'll say, earlier in our journey in some ways. But it's never really a journey where there's an end point. You continue to kind of go up in terms of steps. You continue to create more value from that data. And then I think there's also that realization that there are things that individuals need to be trained on. There are different ways where we all need to interact with the data. And you're able to, as an organization, I think, move a lot quicker. And that could be creating better products and services. It could be helping, in our case, members, but I'll say broader industry customers, but doing things faster, doing them more high quality, and creating just a greater degree of overall value.
Mm-hmm. And with the data literacy programs, so there's a lot of interest in this these days, and people are trying to figure out how to approach this question. So some people build a whole program internally, right? Some use external partners to help them out, right? So also speaking to others who are your peers and you are well connected, right? Which approach have you seen bear fruit, or maybe it's mixed? Usually it's a mix of those, but what is your view on that? Like who should own it? Should you build it in-house? Should you rely on external partnerships mainly? What would be your philosophy?
Yeah, from trying to maximize the success of it, I think an organization first has to recognize that they need it. So even if you have a senior level data leader who wants to start a program, whether internal only or rely more on an external partner, if the senior level executive leaders or the business leaders don't even recognize that that's potentially a problem, it's not really going to get the uptick that would help the organization. There has to be kind of that shared recognition that the organization has challenges with data literacy and that there are ways to pinpoint it. So I would say that that's a really big one. I think secondly, let's say that you do have the right elements internally, you do have the right support to start that data literacy program. There have to be very clear success metrics on how it's going to help the organization. And I think this is an area that many leaders can get tripped up on, because it's not always easy to say, if I bring in this data literacy program, then the company is going to increase their revenues by $50 million. That's not necessarily how it works. But if employees can better utilize data and they can do it better and faster, it will lead to greater value creation. I think the challenge is finding the right metrics that will both balance the heavy quantitative factors along with the qualitative factors, and then also identifying very clear use cases where you can kind of do a before and after comparison of, how long did it take to do something before we did data literacy training versus after the fact. Maybe those individuals now can use self-service analytics. Maybe they know how to interpret many different types of data and analytics. And by being able to do that, they've cut down product creation from 12 weeks to 6 weeks. That would just be a hypothetical example. But I think having very tangible examples where you as a data leader can communicate with all of your business stakeholders in the organization, that goes really far. What you don't want to do is necessarily just focus on things like data quality or the amount of people that have been trained. Those, I think, are an okay starting point, but they're not the be-all, end-all, and that won't get you the momentum that you need to move forward.
And spending maybe just double-clicking a little bit on that whole metrics question, because it's a huge topic where people are looking for, okay, what are the right metrics? How do I identify the right metrics? What would be your approach to this if you wanted to give guidance or support based on your personal experiences?
Yeah, I think for me, what has been helpful is thinking about it. So thinking about it from one of my stakeholder leaders' perspectives. So if I'm a marketing leader, what are the metrics that I want to improve as a part of my division, or even improve for the overall enterprise? And I think really either starting to brainstorm by myself or even meeting with that specific marketing leader and kind of going through, what are those key metrics that they're focused on? I think what that does is then it helps to create a potential pool of metrics that an individual can pull from. And I think this is where, part of it is set in stone, but another part of it is you're testing out different metrics as well. So it's not like at the start of a data literacy program, you come up with 10 metrics and those are the be all end all. I think as you start to go through that program or through different iterations, you might find that some of the metrics stay there. Other ones you may just sunset, you may add in new ones. So it is a little bit more of an iterative process, and that's not a bad thing. I think going in with the mindset that you have to have 10 perfect metrics will actually kind of slow down that progress that you want to see. So there is some level of uncertainty or even discomfort that you have to push through. But once again, if you can align those as much as possible back to business outcomes or business metrics, that will help to de-risk that overall process.
Absolutely. And I think now that we talked about, the chief data officer and the data literacy component of the data culture, So when you establish a data-driven culture, data-centric culture, however you want to look at it, the people who are driving it really dictate how data and analytics will be positioned in that organization, right? So the leadership posture is everything, and even the playbook that you and I talked about, and will also that will kind of produce as your personal view on this particular subject. But what are those components? What would you say that in those three categories? What are those things that they should be focusing on? And maybe this is where we can start to look a little bit closer at your playbook here too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when we think about, I kind of think about it from a data culture standpoint. So if you're trying to create, or maybe you're trying to evolve the current data culture, it really comes down to people and their habits and behaviors. So knowing that culture change is very challenging, people don't change their habits or behaviors overnight. I think what can really help is creating and developing the right relationships, and also continuing to show what's in it for that individual or for that leader or for that team. I think always being able to not just communicate that, but reinforce that message. You may have told the organization a handful of times here and there, but it's almost like you have to keep reinforcing that message periodically. So I think that's a very important component of it. I think the second one, and one that I found essential, is having support from our senior leadership team and the board of directors. I think that's another key pillar for any type of data transformation or data culture evolution. If you don't have that support, or if it is inconsistent, it makes it very challenging to succeed and move forward. So that's another essential piece of it. And then the last one, and this one's kind of tough to categorize. I think as a data leader, you're always going to run into challenges. That's just the nature of working with data and analytics. But having a sense of like energy and optimism, I found that just little things like that can go a very long way. And I think it really shows that if you're confident in what you're doing, I think that confidence can be contagious as well. There are always going to be times where you feel that uncertainty, or you may not be sure, but I think having that confidence just really goes a long way.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And then I think you and I spoke about this idea of thinking about yourself as a business leader first, right? So how should that leadership posture, like how does that really help you think in the big picture, like that element of seeing yourself the right way to understand what kind of change you can actually drive and what the real potential is?
Yeah, this is one, I'd say specifically over these last few years, I've really focused on a lot. And I think a part of it is not only in speaking with other data leaders, but even speaking with a lot of business leaders. When you look at how any organization is managed, you usually have different business divisions. All of those divisions have budgets. They have to do forecasting. They have to ensure that ideally they're staying close to their budget. There are quite a few different, just processes, financial rigor that they have to do. Otherwise, they wouldn't be business leaders. What you tend to find with data teams, though, is I think just overall, in many cases, you find less rigor. So whereas a business team may need, let's say, $1 million next year, and they've allocated it appropriately, what you find with some data teams is that they may have a certain estimate, but they may go way over or way under that estimate. So there's, I think in some cases, that lack of rigor. I also think, too, that if a data leader has come up through the ranks, there are cases where if they've always been technical, or they've started off in a data role, they may not have been given that training on, how do you run a good operation? How do you do financial forecasting? What are some of these different team management components that are very important in that? And then I would say lastly too, like in terms of like the identity, and I think this is where, originally coming from the business side way back when, I haven't really thought of myself as a data leader. I've always thought of myself as a business leader that has the right expertise with, data science, analytics, et cetera. And so I think that also kind of drives where I'm coming from. I don't know if that's necessarily the case with other data leaders, but I think the ones that I look up to, or the ones that are really hitting it out of the park, they have extremely strong just overall business skills, leadership skills, and just building and developing relationships.
Absolutely. I'm really excited about exploring this and how this really comes to life in your team as well. Obviously, in this podcast, we don't have the space to unpack it, but we will definitely dive into that in the board of advisors view and the production as well. Now, something that I did want to talk with you about, though, is Gen AI, because I know that even last year when you and I did the first podcast, that's when the whole Chat GPT hype really started to take over the narratives. Now, obviously, a lot happened since, and it's a very it will be a dense news cycle, I think, this year. I mean, it already is, and it's not going to get any cooler, right, in terms of upcoming election and all that. But Gen AI and AI is something that is still like on top of the important topics when it comes to these discussions. So how did the whole Gen AI narrative develop in your view, let's say, in the past year? And then I will have maybe some specific questions that I even saw that you shared on your LinkedIn, some of the interesting questions behind and underneath this AI discussion. But yeah, what is your quick view on what happened with Gen AI in the past year from a business perspective and where the conversation is developing? Any thoughts from the top of your mind would be very, very interesting to hear.
Sure. Yeah. So I'd say the last year, even the last 2 years, it really kind of came out of nowhere. I mean, the overall techniques, they've been going on for a long time, but I think having something like a Chat GPT or many of these others, it put it in the hands of hundreds of millions of people pretty quickly. And so I think that was a huge change from, what we might now call traditional AI, where you had to have practitioners that had some level of training to be able to get results out of it. With ChatGPT and others, you don't need that. So it made it very easy to use. I think too, at the time, a lot of businesses got very excited about it because they saw it, really being able to be utilized for things like automation or for process redesign, and even things like content creation and other use cases. If I take, maybe after that first year though, then I think companies started really running into the fact that we can't just buy a solution, bring it in-house, and everything works out well. That's when they started to see that technology wasn't the only part of that solution. It does require internal change within an organization. It also requires, I'll say, a pretty well-developed overall AI culture. Because if you have employees that don't know how to use it or that can't apply it to their businesses, you're just kind of paying for a tool that's going to sit out there. And so I think the discussion has become a lot more nuanced. There still is the hype that, it'll help everything. I don't think that that's the case, but I also do think that in some cases that, we as leaders are underestimating the potential of that. And I think with generative AI or even broader AI, you have kind of that parabolic curve, right? It seems like you're making these small steps, maybe over the course of a few months or a few years, and then all of a sudden it will accelerate. So I think we're really at the beginning of that phase.
Mm-hmm. And with as these organizations start to implement AI, and this is something that we talk about in the community as well, like a session from Jody Blomberg, who's the VP of Data Science over at Cox Automotive. She's also a member of the board of advisors, the Data Storytellers, and she did her podcast also fully on the idea that these Gen AI checks are coming due, right? And how can you prepare to make sure that you invest in the right initiatives, that you manage this the right way. So what are some of those, um, I don't want to say obstacles, but maybe those realizations that you think businesses have now after and will have in the next 6 months without getting into, trying to figure out what will happen in the future because it's hard to know, right? But in your opinion, what will be some of those big realizations that will dawn on businesses and business leaders about the realities of AI?
Sure. I think a part of it, and we're always going to get the question whether it's data AI or Gen AI related. There's always eventually going to be the question of what is the ROI, and that's always a challenging question to answer. I don't think the benefit's not always dollars and cents, but I think the flip side of that, and thinking back to the CDO being a business leader, you can't just say that, well, we're going to bring in this Gen AI solution and everything's going to be better. There needs to be more rigor around that. I think what that has done is it's made many organizations not necessarily want to be the first mover, but more of like that fast follower. So as they start to see use cases that are legitimately helping organizations, that's what they can latch onto. I think there's also the element of, you don't have to implement this and be using it completely throughout the entire organization. You can start with various individuals or even teams and start to develop the fluency, start to execute on a smaller amount of use cases. And then when you have success on it, you can kind of keep working your way up there. And I think what that does is it helps organizations not necessarily have to spend millions of dollars at the outset, but have almost like a phased investment approach. So if they do run into any challenges or they're not getting the long-term ROI that they want to get, you haven't sunk all of your investment dollars into it. You're able to pivot. You're able to maybe recalibrate what that overall strategy looks like.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'd say lastly, back to the ROI piece, if somebody were to ask you, what is the total ROI of data in your organization? I don't know if anybody can really answer that. There are a lot of different financial models. There are some built-in assumptions. But if you take the flip side of that, if all of the data were to leave an organization and they didn't have it, every organization would be at a standstill. So I think we know that there's value there. But I use that example because I think that's the direction that AI is going in. I think that organizations are going to be so heavily reliant on it now and in the future that is a part of that value proposition, right? If let's say you're in retail and all of your competitors are using AI to understand their customer demographics, their purchasing patterns, predicting how they're going to purchase it, you can't be competitive as a retailer if you're not utilizing those same techniques. Eventually, you'll become irrelevant. And I think you'll become irrelevant a lot sooner because AI is changing so quickly and it's accelerating. It's not like you're going to have decades to eventually try and catch up. And I think that's kind of the scary part about competition with companies that are appropriately using AI.
Mm-hmm. So it's definitely here to stay. So it will be fascinating to see how that evolves. And I know a lot of our members are working on exciting things. So the next couple of months and years will be, very cool to watch. And just connected to this conversation of Gen AI, and this is maybe shifting gears a little bit for this final question that I wanted to ask you because I saw that you posted about it, and I think it's a fascinating part of this evolving discussion of AI, and this has to be with the technology itself. So I think it was a post. I don't know exactly which post. I'm just looking at kind of like a short piece that I captured there that was about really censorship in AI and the integrity of the models themselves and the efficacy of Gen AI and just AI in general, and the question of, okay, how should we approach the regulation and the censorship of information? Maybe can you say a few words around that? Maybe even which specific case that was. I only captured your thoughts around it and less the case study. So maybe if you remember, you can mention that because I would love to understand how you viewed the topic.
Sure. It really relates back to bias. So bias in AI, and there are a lot of not just organizations, but individuals that are talking very seriously about the fact that, well, there's all of this bias in AI, and because that bias is there, how can we actually utilize it effectively? Like, are we amplifying that potential bias because the underlying data is extremely biased? And kind of my counterpoint to that is, you're never going to have data that is completely unbiased in any form or fashion. And I think where that mindset, kind of that censorship mindset, or maybe not doing certain things around it, what that does is kind of twofold. I think it really stifles potential innovation that would actually help people. And I think, I'm in the healthcare industry, right? Some of that innovation could actually save lives. So if you're going to kind of, hamstring it, know that could have very detrimental effects to, in our case, members, but in other industries, customers. I think the second piece, though, and one that isn't talked about as much, is that if you're using, let's say, a chat GPT, and let's say that the organization that creates it is putting in certain business rules behind the scenes to try and control for that bias, that will eventually make the results either more biased or just completely irrelevant. Like, it will essentially break the entire algorithm. And I think that's what many people just don't realize. So if you're prompting a GPT solution, in some cases you're wanting to get an answer, in other cases you might want certain content. If that starts to output content that maybe in our current society is kind of considered more acceptable, but you're almost like changing history, I think that can be very problematic. And so that's something that I'm sure is not going to go away necessarily. But I also think too, like, we're all adults, and at the end of the day, we have to exercise our independent judgment. Nobody should ever use any type of output from a Gen AI solution verbatim. There should always be some type of human in the loop critical judgment around it.
And I think we're also starting to understand the real place of these solutions in our lives, because even a year ago we had different assumptions, and now as we're actually using it, as it actually finds its natural organic place in our lives, some of those decisions are becoming more nuanced as well. So we love to explore that side of the discussion too. So I found that, and I agree with you 100% that it's a dangerous game to play when you start to like tinker with that of like changing and shifting and contorting reality, especially with powerful solutions now with AI. Well, we do it at our own peril. So this is great. We love working with people like you who, really have exciting stories, and we look forward to developing this further with you and then showcasing it on our Board of Advisors expert panel.
Thank you, Laszlo. Yeah, I always appreciate the discussion, and I think just in speaking with you, the community, and other data leaders, I'm always learning as well, and so I always learn as well from these types of conversations.
Yeah, well, it's been our pleasure, and the journey continues. Sir, always a pleasure, and all the best to you.
Thank you.